We're going to get started. My name is Kristen Washington. I'm a fourth-year PhD student in the Department of American... Things are happening. I am a fourth-year PhD student in the Department of American Studies, and I'm also a graduate assistant here at the Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities, as well as with ACHUM, the African American Digital and Experimental Humanities Lab. So I wanted to say thank you for you all being here, both in person and online, and we're going to get started with introductions. So we have Olivia Barnard here, who is a PhD student in the Department of History at Johns Hopkins University. She received a Bachelor of Arts from Tulane University in Political Science and Africana Studies, where her honors thesis earned her the distinction of Senior Scholar. Her research interests include histories of slavery, womanhood, widowhood, and gender in mid-18th century New Orleans and its Atlantic world. We also have Layla K. Blackbird here, who is a Louisiana Creole and unenrolled adoptee of Mescalero, Lipan, and East Cherokee descent. She is the Posen Family Human Rights Doctoral Fellow of U.S. and Atlantic History at the University of Chicago, and she serves as a Senior Research Editor for Keywords for Black Louisiana, an NHPRC-funded project. PI by Jessica Marie Johnson at Johns Hopkins University. Layla's research is situated at the intersection of Black and Native histories of the Gulf South. Her dissertation, entitled Embodied Violence in the Shatter Zone, Settler Colonialism and Slavery on America's Third Coast, is a study of the relationship between settler colonialism and the enslavement of indigenous and Afro-Indigenous peoples, especially women and girls, and how it has functioned across French, Spanish, and Anglo-American regimes. Layla's work has appeared in books such as Louisiana Creole Peoplehood and What is History Now, and in academic journals, including 18th Century Studies, and most recently, the William and Mary Quarterly. We also have Ellie Palazzolo, and Ellie Palazzolo is a PhD candidate in history and in history at Johns Hopkins, and co-project manager and digital curatorial fellow for the Keywords for Black Louisiana project. Ellie's research focuses around labor and consumerism during the late 19th century industrialization of the U.S. food system. On the DH side of things, Ellie is interested in critical digital studies, metadata, and web design, and always curious to learn about new project approaches and tools. Jessica Marie Johnson is an associate professor in the Department of History at the Johns Hopkins University and a fellow at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Studies at Harvard University. Johnson is a historian of Atlantic slavery and the Atlantic African diaspora. She is also the author of Wicked Flesh, Black Women, Intimacy, and Freedom in the Atlantic World, which has most recently won the 2021 Laura Romero First Book Publication Prize of the American Studies Association. Johnson is an internationally recognized digital humanist. Johnson is the director of Life Xcode Digital Humanities Against Enclosure and senior research associate with the Center for the Digital Humanities at Johns Hopkins University. Johnson is PI of Black Beyond Data, a Black Studies Computational and Social Sciences Lab with co-PIs Kim Gallen and Alexandra White. Alongside Dr. Yamada C. Figueroa, Johnson also co-organizes the Diaspora Solidarities Lab, a Mellon-funded multi-university initiative applying Black feminist methodologies to collaborative scholarship. Johnson is co-editor with Lauren Tilton and David Mino of Debates in the Digital Humanities, Computational Humanities. She is guest editor of Slavery in the Machine, a special issue of Archipelago's Journal. A warm welcome to you all, and thank you so much for being here. We'll get started.
Thank you all so much. Good afternoon, everyone. We're still in the afternoon. Thank you, Myth. Thank you, Dr. Parham. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, everybody who made this possible, and also for the time change. I know the digital dialogues are normally at lunchtime, but we really appreciate the accommodation to a really hectic schedule, but that's how April is in the end of the semester times. We're gonna have a roundtable format, so we'll sort of all talk a little bit about something, and then we'll open it up for conversation. We're very, very excited to be here, being able to talk about this micro edition with scholarly editing and Keywords Black Louisiana in general is culmination of a lot of history, not just histories of slavery, but also history within this project. And so thank you all so much. I'm going to kick us off with our history. Keywords Black Louisiana is a Life Code Digital Humanities Against Enclosure project. So Life Code was founded in 2020 with myself and Christina Thomas. As I've talked about before in many different places, thinking about slavery and the digital, slavery and data is a really critical aspect of the work. It is not work that we're new to, so I definitely want to shout out Dr. Gwendolyn Hall, who recently passed away, who wrote Africans in Colonial Louisiana and also helped create and was lead on the Afro-Louisiana History and Genealogy database, which is really one of the first slavery and data databases, certainly one of the first comprehensive research corpora around Africans in Louisiana. Our work is very much in that tradition, and it was also a people-centered database as she described it in my conversations with her and in interviews with her, and we'll get into what that might mean. So when we founded Keywords Black Louisiana, it was part of the founding of Life Code Digital Humanities Against Enclosure, which now is a collective of labs, projects, and members we have probably I think 10 or 11 institutions, probably 70 or so projects and labs, and definitely pushing into 200 members. It has been a really incredible journey that looks something like this. From our first sort of initial foray of like 20 graduate students and myself. Keywords Black Louisiana at that time was maybe 6 other graduate students. Now it is very much part of a bigger collection of labs. You can see the little arrows pointing to where Keywords is on the map. And also, as you'll see in the graph that I show, we have expanded in really incredible ways. But our mission in a lot of ways remains the same. So Keywords Black Louisiana is a collective of researchers creating digital projects that highlight Black and Black Native life and culture of the Gulf Coast, Louisiana. And so what that means is that we are thinking about how can data, in the ways that it's hacked and in the way that it exists, really highlights Africans and people of African descent in all of their formulations. We are thinking in the most expansive ways of Blackness, which gets very complicated in many places and must be historicized. But in our most expansive version of Blackness, what are the ways that we can use tools, hack tools, remix, create, and destroy tools in order to highlight Black life and Black humanity? We began after sort of starting off in 2020, and everybody here was there originally in 2020. And they'll talk a little bit about how the Scholarly Edition is part of those origins. A couple of years into Life Code's work and Keywords work, we were awarded a National Historic Publications and Records Commission planning grant. And that was a 2-year planning grant, part of a cohort of grant projects that's continuing now. That was focused on underrepresented digital editions, right? So African American, Latinx, Asian, Native American projects. We were part of that first initial cohort, which is something that is really exciting for us to be part of that community. And that was a 2-year grant, 2022 to 2024. I'm happy to report that we did receive the implementation version of that, which allows us to continue in this work. And so we'll get to be able to do that and are continuing to do that in this 2024 year. In that time, we have been able to build out all kinds of workflows, processes, ways of thinking about the work, and a community, as you see here, that are all very much committed, again, to anti-racist and decolonial work, to centering Black life and humanity, and to thinking about how we can create a digital edition that is responsive to Black history, histories of Africans, and histories of African descent in the Gulf Coast, and is actually accessible to folks along the Gulf Coast themselves and led by Black community engagement. And so this is, in a lot of ways, the bigger umbrella of what is the scholarly edition. And I'll turn it over to Lila and Olivia.
Thank you. So by the time the 2021 call for contributions was published by the Scholarly Editing, we had already sort of been collecting stories or documents that centered Black life and humanity within the Colonial Archive. We may not have started the transcription and translation process at that point, but we were learning very much how to work with the paleography, the 18th century script, and also part of the learning curve came from learning how to use the digital database from which to find these stories. I think it would be remiss to not mention, Life X Code was founded in 2020, and we were working in the wake of both the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020, which were foundational to thinking about how we were entering into these records. You'll notice we'll talk about keywords down the line, but I just sort of want to briefly mention that wellness became a keyword sort of in this moment as we were thinking about how to sort of deal with the records that were, of course, written by enslavers and their allies that sort of written from their perspective, and therefore the emphasis in some of the records was on the valuation of Black bodies and the ways in which the documentations written by plantation doctors didn't give us a sense of how Black people in the moment were responding to these illnesses and conditions that they were facing. And so sort of just thinking through that and thinking with on the ground how grassroots organizations like Southern Solidarity, which was focusing on how to basically give resources and come together and mutual aid in order to, sorry, I'm struggling right now, in order to,
slow down.
Thank you, in order to think about how, not only how are people responding right now, but how that shapes how we're thinking about the records. So I'll pass it on for a second, sorry.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So this is kind of a view of where we were and what life was like at the time that we were beginning our scholarly edition, but also at the very origins of our project, of our Keywords project. As Olivia mentioned, we were in peak pandemic, and also at this juncture we were surrounded quite literally by ongoing protest. And so these framings became foundational to the way that we were thinking through our documents, but also the project overall. What does it mean to be responsible? What does it mean to be accountable? What does it mean to do this work? And to do this work in ways that might be different, might have an opportunity to push boundaries or to rethink the ways in which we engage with the archive and the violences of the archive. And so this is what kind of brought us to Black DH overall. Kind of organically, we began a process of thinking through these big critical questions and disjunctures, and myself being someone that is from the descendant community and grew up in New Orleans and was really rooted there, what it meant to think through these documents holistically, in a sense of ethical praxis, but also really finely attuned to the contours of those threads that move between history and present, right? How are we responsive to the ancestor, and how is the current political moment shaped by the very documents that we're holding? How are our realities situated, and what critical tools can we use? So this is what brought us to really engaging deeply with Black DH and critical DH scholarship as our founding principles and foundational ethos. I'll have a slide if you want to.
Yeah, I think that once we sort of realized we were doing Black DH, we were really happy to find an incredible and growing body of scholarship about it. We were sort of joking earlier that I started doing more research on the scholarship because I'm very bad at reading French paleography, which I think will be justified when we show some of those documents later. But some of the earliest texts that we engaged, we have the citations for here. In particular, I was drawn to the ways in which Black DH seemed to be grappling with this sort of longstanding question of textual recovery and Black studies with sort of new methods in archives. So one of the earliest articles that we read together was Kim Gallen's Making a Case for the Black Digital Humanities. And there Dr. Gallen is talking about how the technology of recovery that undergirds Black studies writ large is foundational to Black digital scholarship. But I think more importantly, she situates Black DH as a line of inquiry that is diving into this tension between a politics of recovery that's working to reclaim Black literary heritage and humanity and the racializing possibilities of digital tools. And I was reading that sort of hand in hand with Rafika Rassam's New Digital Worlds, which discusses the importance of digital humanities as a way to sort of bridge colonial pasts and imperial presence by really making sure that the voices that can be misrepresented or underrepresented in kind of drawing out some of those controversies and conflicts are really brought to the fore. And I think that thinking about textual recovery with both of those like really wonderful pieces of scholarship kind of hand in hand with really new work in Black studies from Black feminist scholars like Marissa Fuentes, Sadia Hartman, and Dr. Johnson was very foundational to how we were thinking about text and textual representation from the sort of perspective of Black DH, and we were also really glad to put ourselves in conversation with a number of projects that were working on similar things. The early Caribbean Digital Archive has been a really key interlocutor for us. That's a great project worth checking out. What they've done there is dug through sort of texts from enslavers and diaries and histories that might have a footnote or a short excerpt about enslaved people there, but that hasn't really been brought out until they have gone and recatalogued, done some really cool metadata and representation. So that was kind of an admirable project for us at the beginning. And then two, we watched the digital dialogue from Caitlin Pollack and Jessica Liu that was here in 2019. We watched it a little late and on YouTube, but I think it was a huge source of inspiration. And I think that that's like a very interesting kind of full circle moment in thinking about Black DH broadly and how the scholarship is really important, but there's so much praxis that we've been able to learn and experience, and just like being here and being well fed and warmly welcomed, I think has been a huge part of that over the last couple of years too.
Yeah, and having us as a team kind of being situated in that historical moment, so that was 2019, 2020. Of course, we're new grad students, it's all our first year, and so we're engaging in these conversations and these historiographies for the first time. Of course, this work is already being done. Dr. Johnson is like shepherding us through like our own coming to conclusions and our own like creation of the same ethical contexts and conclusions as the work that is in progress, and that's really awesome.
And I just want to add, and thank you for bearing with me, I'm not the public speaker of the group, but I want to add too that thinking about the sort of boundlessness of Black DH and how the work is always ongoing, nothing is never finished, so regardless of what we put up on this site, I think the really exciting thing is that generations beyond us are going to come to this work and have something else to say about it. And yeah, that's part of the excitement, I think, with the site.
Yeah, and all of that is to say that being deeply engaged with Black DH centered us in one really foundational question, which might seem silly, but is actually a little controversial in the world of scholarly editing, which is, what if we decenter the document and center the person?
So this little clip here is just a little preview of the scholarly editing sites that is to come, where the micro edition will live, and the QR code will take you to the staging site, but it is not final, and the staging site will disappear. So do not rely on it. But for the purposes of this conversation, if you want to explore there, you can. So when we were thinking about documents and, sort of decentering it, first we had to start with the documents, right? One of the things that we, one of the reasons that we all came together, and one of the reasons I come to Gulf Coast Louisiana, is because individuals and their communities are so legible and so visible in this archive. The French and Spanish documents are incredibly rich with enslaved people, free people of African descent, grappling with slave owners' restrictions, resisting, engaging in marronage, engaging in a whole range of kinship practices, and engaging in a whole lifestyle and livingness that I think is not necessarily unique to them in this place, but the archive, this particular archive, and the archival conventions allow us to see it differently, right? So one of the documents that always jumped out at me, the story of Mama Kumba. I talk about it a little bit in the book. It's first cited in the most recent literature by Gwen Hall, where she talks about this document as being the first documentary reference to gumbo in the colonial archives in 1764. And that always fascinated me. What fascinated me more is that when you go into the document itself, which we, were able to do in cahoots with the New Orleans Jazz Museum, which created this database I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. That document is part of a whole series of documents that are around fugitivity, that involve runaway enslaved men, that involve networks of kinship and marriage and partnership, that do involve the carceral punishment of the state. So there's actually a lot that is laid around this one reference of gumbo. And I think that's really demonstrates some of the key ways that the documents themselves are important, but there are also so many different ways of thinking about how we knit together the documents with individuals and their fullness of their lives. The Louisiana Colonial Documents Digitization Project is based at the New Orleans Jazz Museum, which is part of the Louisiana Historical Center, and in this establishment called, or most recently called, for those of us who go to Louisiana a lot, the Old Mint. So this project is a database. They have digitized and placed online in JPEG format the extant documents at that archive. The Louisiana Historical Center holds 2/5 of the available colonial documents. When I say colonial documents as far as Louisiana, I'm talking about 18th century primarily. So like 17 teens up to 1803, right? The other 3/5 or so, and there's fuzzy numbers, are at the New Orleans Editorial Archives. Most of those are the Spanish documents, and there's a tiny set that's at the city archives. So when we're talking about, like being able to kind of grapple with, the richness of Black life, there's a decent core of that material that has been digitized and placed online. Is available with some metadata and some information. However, one of the things that we found was that when we went to go look at the documents and to sort of learn more about them, the available metadata around these documents in the database site is focused primarily on document information, provenance, so like dates, where the document was created, so New Orleans, sometimes Natchitoches is in there, what year, some individuals, primarily the individuals of European descent are listed as far as metadata, and a couple of subject headings that are sort of scattered across different documents. Some are more extensive and some are less extensive than others. But sort of basic document information that you might get from a card catalog, right? So very useful, but not necessarily as useful as we wanted it to be if we were going to focus on Black life, right? So what we did was, it just was before, in a lot of ways, the scholarly editing became available as an option. We used Airtable to create tables that would let us add more metadata to the information of different documents, right? So we built off of the available metadata at the New Orleans Jazz Museum and in their document site, and then we added things like names of people of African descent who are in the document, names of individuals of indigenous descent. We added a space for an abstract, and our abstracts, of course, focus primarily on what is going on in the story of someone like Mama Kumba, who at the time is holding essentially a gathering, a dinner of a whole host of individuals. So there's actually a lot of different names that we get to bring into the bias set. There's a lot of information around what is happening at this event that we can bring in. And then we also, use keywords as a way to kind of really focus in and think about how can we re-index how people might engage in a document like this, right? So instead of a document that is essentially a penal document about individuals of African descent who are getting caught, gathering when they're not supposed to, and runaways who are getting caught, away from their owners, now it's a document that is potentially about fugitivity. It's certainly about kinship, because it's about individuals who are gathering together, who have some, intimate relationship with each other. I don't think we use wellness with this document or manumission, but keywords became a function for us to think about what are the other ways of understanding these documents that were way off the beaten track from how enslavers first were imagining what those documents were supposed to be, which is essentially a state function. And so Mama Kumba is a really good example of that, and her document is one of those documents that's in the scholarly editing sites.
And as we've sort of already laid out, one of our main interventions was centering people rather than documents within the scholarly edition. So, recognizing the importance of a manuscript source, but also wondering how we might challenge the authority of it. And this, of course, means, as we sort of laid out, following the threads in the archive, but also thinking wider about the geography, the life, what was happening in the time period, and really centering the people in the story. One sort of example of how we tried to do this in the edition, we meet Jeanette and Pierre, who are two enslaved children on the Crustilas plantation near New Orleans in the 1730s. We meet them through a death certificate in the archive. And if we stopped there with the documents, that might be all we have to say about their lives. But when we took a step back and thought about, okay, what can we learn about them through the archive, we began to look for documents that centered other Africans and their descendants on the same plantation in the same time period. And then we finally meet someone named Hippolyte, who is an enslaved man who becomes sick around the same time that both of these children become ill. And we start to imagine a sort of space in which they receive care from Hippolyte, or a space in which he may be able to sort of give them sort of comfort in that moment. And also importantly, when we think even wider, we recognize that they were living through what becomes known as the Second French-Chickasaw War in 1739. So their enslaver is actually away near present-day Arkansas at Fort St. Francis, which I forgot is on this map, one of the first circles up there. And you can think about the sort of ways in which the distance and space really creates a sort of new map for us for thinking about the archive. Additionally, I want to mention, just because we have the sort of transcriptions and translations finished, doesn't mean that these documents, doesn't mean that the stories we're telling are people-centered. So thinking with Moya Bailey's ethics of pace here was really important, not just for thinking about the pace, or the pace of trust, I think is how she references it in there. With our collaborators for Keywords for Black Louisiana that are on the ground, our community partners in New Orleans, but also recognizing that the work is not done just because we have the document finished, just because the transcription and translation is finished. We actually don't have a people-centered story now. So really sort of taking a step back and thinking about the world, that they were living beyond the one story we get in that death certificate.
So that brings us to the actual kind of brass tacks of the documents. As we continued this work and we were thinking people-centered and we were trying to find people, obviously that interconnectivity and the imagining of worlds became really important to how we engaged with these documents. And so kinship became not only a keyword, but I think kind of a grounding principle, one that is reflected in Black studies, one that is reflected in Native studies, and one that really kind of is saying stop and think about the humanity, and not just the individual, but the collective and what this all means. So I want to talk to you about two women named Maria Juana. First, we have a Maria Juana, negra esclava de Don Juan Soraray, who was she was my leader through this world. Me and our original, one of our editors that's was on the original team, Emma Bilski.
Dr. Emma Bilski now.
Oh, that's right. Dr. Emma Bilski. We wound up being the ones that were focused on the Spanish documents, but I knew Spanish. I could read and write Spanish. I had never looked at Spanish paleography before, right? This is, ground level of grad school. And here we are. You'll see on here that we have this one folio that is 676 pages. 676 pages. Woo! So when we're trying to understand Maria Juana and the world that she's living in, we have a lot of information, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And so Maria Juana became like a guide for me. I was also at this time writing, Emma and I had chosen the pieces, the documents that we were focusing on, kind of because they overlapped with our dissertations. And Maria Juana, for me, was someone who in this document is trying to press charges and discuss abuse by an enslaver. Mm-hmm. And this is an enslaver that I had tracked in an entirely different context under his French name, which was Jean Serre de la Rue, trafficking enslaved indigenous women up and down the entire province of Louisiana, from what was then Quepaw territory down to the mouth of the river. So what emerges from this text is a Maria Juana that also is a guide to explaining how individual enslavers, individual men, were complicit in multiple forms of trafficking, different modes of violence, and how that was their lives. That is who they were as people. But it also gave us this window to sitting with a Maria Juana who was so strong and so powerful in her contribution to the legal architectures of the time, because she had the audacity to stand up for herself in this context. And through these many pages of depositions, she taught me Spanish paleography. So thank you, Maria Juana. Our second Maria Juana appears in what is a uniquely Louisiana context, in that she has a Spanish name, but her documents are in French because it is the Spanish period, but she's living in a place called Pointe Coupée, where the politicians hadn't switched to Spanish administration yet, so all of the depositions are being taken in French.
I'm sorry, could you please briefly describe what Esclave Grief de Sir Antoine Sarrazin?
Absolutely. I'm going there right now.
Okay.
So we have Maria Juana as the Spanish name, but she is described in the document as Esclave Grief de Sir Antoine Sarrazin. So an Esclave Grief is a woman of both Black and Native descent, and her case was someone who was biracial. Her mother was an enslaved Plains Apache woman. Her father was an unnamed enslaved Black man on the plantation of one of Sarrazin's compatriots. This document and the story we're telling is actually about her son. Her son Antoine, also named Antoine Sarrazin because he was given his father's name, is a Creole, white, native, Black, enslaved on the plantation of a man named Poydras, Julien Poydras, who is very powerful, one of the most elite of the elite. And during this period, there had been a move in governance to Spanish law, which gave opportunity for people of Native descent to challenge their enslavement on legal grounds. Antoine attempted to do that unsuccessfully for him and his sister Marie. Meanwhile, his aunt Cecilia successfully was liberated. His mother was not. The difference was who their enslaver was. Poydras himself was someone that was so powerful he was like, I'm not gonna follow the law. What are you gonna do about it? So what we have is a story about Antoine and his kinship networks across multiple plantations, forming the backbone of a conspiracy to overthrow all of the enslavers of this particular region. It's known as the 1795 Point Coupe uprising. So this gave us an opportunity to sit with another place and another time and another set of people and connections. And this marijuana in different documents that are not on part of the site, but I've spent time with those documents, and she is petitioning for the freedom of her children. She is speaking on behalf of her sister. She is another bold voice for emancipation and for the freedom of and respect of the humanity of enslaved Black people in Louisiana at this time. So what we have up here is also a teeny tiny preview of what that transcription and translation practice looks like. We had seen earlier what that raw document was and the transcription. And this is a preview of what that looks like as a finished product on the site, which brings us to the digital backbone.
Say something about our translation and the racialized language.
Yeah. I would be happy to. Another thing, because we will return to this as well, I believe, or would be happy to discuss it in the Q&A. But you can see here that we made editorial choices. We're going to get to those editorial choices later, but one of the main ones with the transcription and translation was to not change words like esclave grief, because they held very important legal distinctions at the time. And whereas a woman who was Afro-descended or African may appear one way, how she is classified legally gave her different accesses. Likewise, a Native woman, how she was classified, gave her different accesses within that structure. And this changed over time and was complex. Racialization is complex. Racialization in a society that was creolizing is incredibly complex. So we wanted to, instead of doing a recovery of deleting racialized language, of allowing that language to stay in the original French or Spanish as a signifier of how this person may have moved in the world, and to not make assumptions out of how they would have self-identified or thought of themselves. In Maria Juana's case, this Maria Juana, she was very proudly both Black and Native.
So before we move to the demo of the site and Q&A, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the back end of what we've been working with in terms of TEI and our collaboration with scholarly editing. One of the reasons why working with scholarly editing has been so cool and inspiring is because the journal, I think thanks in a large part to RAF, has been oriented towards some of the same minimal computing, digital ethics that we've been focused on as a project. So really just trying to build sites that are compact, sustainable, and accessible at various degrees of bandwidth. So that has both been, I think, a good point of synergy and a real inspiration for us as we've worked towards developing some of the rest of our project. There are huge suites of software for textual editing and born digital editions, but RAF introduced us to a really, I think, savvy kind of lean model working with Visual Studio Code or VS Code and GitLabs in order to have a great collaborative space and I think a really sustainable digital ecosystem. And I'm happy to talk more about the sort of ins and outs of some of that in Q&A too. But basically what we have here is the back end of what our scholarly edition looks like. A little bit of TEI, which is a descriptive encoding language. It's an XML language, textual encoding initiative. And a lot of the transcription and translation of our documents. So I'll just talk about some of the tags that you see here. The first and probably the most important that we've sort of been referencing over the course of this conversation is the person name tag or purse name. I think one of our sort of most interesting discussions about that was our decision to use that reference ID, which you can see it's like ref and then equals and then KL and then a number. I think anytime working in slavery's archive, thinking about numbers and numbered ways to describe people can be really tricky. So we had to really think seriously about how we were justifying that and what it could do for us that wouldn't just kind of re-enumerate.
And one of those things, one of those grounding principles that we'll come back to in our editorial choices is the complexity of an archive where you have so many people who are unnamed. So this was an ability for us to continue to focus on the person, while never, that number is not who they are on the site. That's how we are doing it in the code.
Exactly. So that was the second reason that I was going to say we've decided to do this. The first one is, I think Lila's example is perfectly emblematic of it. There are a lot of people who have the same name. The second is that there are a lot of people who are unnamed, and by trying to collect as much information as we can about them, we're hoping that it could be possible that we could see, if we know an age or a location or some sort of kinship details about them, that we can try to track them through the documents a little bit more carefully. And then the third reason, which I think we've also sort of alluded to, is that there can be really different spellings in French and Spanish, and even, 3 different spellings within French, or as we see in the Mama Komba document, if you all have a chance to look at it later, there can be one person who's referred to using a series of different names. So having the reference ID was a way for us to, I guess, kind of collect that. We added the sort of KL as the identifier, kinship belonging, as a way to maybe make it look a little less numbery. And then 2, I think we can look at this on the site, but we've also created a page on the site where you can just look at the people, and there's no way other than downloading the TEI that a user would see, say, a list of numbers. And this is what we were using to collect information about the people who are in the document. So you can see we've tried to use the information that we have from the sort of context and kind of outstanding research to add as much information as we can in terms of trying to have not just the number, not just the name or sort of unnamed reference, but also as much kind of biographical information as we're able to glean from the documents. As far as other elements go, the keywords have been a huge part of the project, very much at the heart. We used the seg tag, which stands for an arbitrary segment, and then the ANA element, which is for analysis. There is a keywords tag in TEI. It's mostly used, I think, in headers to kind of get big picture encapsulations of keywords. So this allowed us to really draw out the very particular parts of the documents that we were interested in identifying with a certain keyword. And then there are a few more that might be of interest, kind of basic stuff for the types of manuscript documents that we were working in. The high-rend soup is for superscripts. There were a few places where we added some editorial additions, and those are indicated through, say, the supplied tag, where we then justified why we did that. And then there are some expansions here where if the original kind of abbreviated annotation might have been difficult to understand, we added a bit of an expansion, and that will toggle on and off in the edition ultimately. We also tagged place name, which we haven't been able to do much with yet, but hopefully just having the tag in there speaks to our interest in having an eye to geography and the importance of Black geographies and the stories that we're trying to tell, and hopefully we can do more with something like that in the future. And one reason why I wanted to have Lila give the explanation of our decision to keep some of the racialized language in the English translation was because that was, I think, one of our more interesting editorial choices on the back end. There's a TEI tag called foreign, which is used for foreign languages in documents that are in not the same language as that excerpt might be in. And we felt pretty strongly that we didn't want to use that because we're talking about a bilingual or trilingual or multilingual society, and it felt a little odd and incorrect to say that the language was foreign when it was just different.
And if I may, one of the other considerations there is understanding the present of Creole folks in Louisiana whose language is critically endangered. And we have to think of Creole, which has foundations in this time period, as an indigenous African language, an Afro-Indigenous language that is indigenous to Louisiana. So rendering any element of it as foreign felt disrespectful.
And what we decided to do instead was use this tag IMF, which is for emphasis, and we thought that it was a better representation of how we were perceiving our use of French or Spanish in the translation. So with that, I think we can take a look at the staging site, and we had some really rich conversations early on about how we wanted to lay everything out and what we sort of wanted to center on our different pages. It's been an interesting, we were looking back at some of our sort of early notes and planning and preparation for this talk, and there's, I think some of our first conversations about having 1 or 2 documents, and then a year later we were talking about, maps and full editions, and we've landed somewhere in between, which I think is really beautiful. And while we're looking at this, I want to just shout out Raph again. He's been incredibly helpful and very patient, and we've learned a lot from him, and we wouldn't be anywhere near the stage. If you do want to check out the QR code, the mobile edition is also awesome, and we don't even know how much time and care you've put into that, but thank you, Raph.
We wanted that to be accessible for folks, as many people are accessing information via handheld devices. And this, for those of you currently in-house, you can see the site, the staging site here previewed. For those that are online, please feel free to look through with us. But we wanted to take this opportunity to show you a couple of those elements that we have centered. Just first and foremost, we put them up front here. So we have stories, we have keywords, and we have people. So everything is exactly as we've indicated there. I don't know if anyone wants to go through specific elements. I'd be happy to move around if you wanted to talk about.
Why did you show them on the Kumba doc? Okay. So as Lee was pulling it up, every aspect of the site, the abstracts, the placement, the links, all of that was done in conversation with Raph. Everything is very, very intentional. We wanted to make it accessible in the sense of somebody working in Black Louisiana, maybe it was a teacher, maybe it was a tour guide, could go to the site and really get a kind of clear grasp of the different parts that are available, whether it's the introduction, and you guys just saw, if you're looking at it, you can read it, but you saw sort of that first line is Black Louisiana as a template, or Louisiana as a template. That is a line from an event that Life Code and Electric Marinage and the Center for Africana Studies at JHU held with Christina K. Robinson, and so those are her words where she's talking about the ways that the Gulf Coast, New Orleans, Louisiana are all templates for thinking about some of these huge questions around race, racialization, slavery, anti-racist work, and Marinage and decoloniality. So if we look at Mama Kumba's doc, just to kind of bring it full circle, we have the transcription itself here. And then if you click on, show facsimile, we also were able to have the page images thanks to the Louisiana Historical Center. Those page images that are in that database, we're able to have them there. So folks can, take a look at our transcription, but also look at that paleography as well. And, if people want to kind of compare and contrast, totally fine. In a lot of ways, transcriptions are conversations both with the documents, but also with what is happening in language in the present day. We have, you can see at the top bar, you have kinship, wellness, and fugitivity. All of those are color coded throughout the document. So as you go through, you'll see hyperlinks that will pop up in those colors, so you're able to kind of see not just that this document is about kinship, but also that there are different elements within the document that reference the other kinds of keywords. So it's incredibly networked, it's incredibly hyperlinked, and we wanted it to be that way in purpose. We wanted to sort of demonstrates through the TI and also through the design how interlinked these kinds of topics and ideas, and I would argue theorization of Africans, is, even in a document that is not meant to necessarily show and have that. What other elements? You can see them side by side. And I feel like I want to thank Ralph. We put him through it. Ralph was like, what ideas do you have? We were like, well, let me tell you. And we had many, and many fell on the cutting room floor, and maybe for other iterations or for the larger digital edition of the keywords. But some of them were able to stick around. So we do have the side-by-side iteration, which we really wanted to have so that folks would be able to see line by line how things compare, but also so that folks would be able to kind of see very easily in an almost multilingual way, like here is a conversation in different languages. Also important to note that the way that we did the English translation was we took the step of having very strict translations of, or strict as possible translations of the transcription from the paleographic to either French or Spanish, but we shifted to more modern translations with the idea of that kind of accessibility. So again, because we kept the Black community and descendant community as our compass north, we made different choices than maybe a more traditional scholarly edition or editing project or transcription project might make. So.
Absolutely. And
I think one thing too worth mentioning here is that you might notice that our tab here is called Stories, even though we've been talking a lot about documents, and that has been one of our most, I think, an important step that the scholarly edition has led us to, that again is being reflected in our broader project and on our website. So instead of kind of following some of the logic of the Colonial Archive and the original digitization, instead of representing document for document, kind of how we've been transcribing and translating, we're really trying to find coherences between people and events that can allow us to narrate something in a different way that's not, I think, as dependent on that kind of initial organizational structure. I don't know if you guys want to build on that at all.
yeah, doing so, as you know, we've all alluded to, and as Dr. Johnson just said, keeping descendant community as our compass north, allows us to have certain questions that then become, well, it is no question why we have to do this. This is correct. And having collaborators such as Roth, who have generously allowed us to essentially break the code a little bit or think outside of the box in ways that might be confusing to people that are traditional scholarly editing folks, right, who want to know, well, why are you doing it like this? So in our introductions, we've also posed those questions and thought through and articulated for folks why we're doing this, how we're threading individual lives across multiple documents in the archive, and why that's important. And this will show you here our collection of those stories that we were able to put together for this.
To build on what Leela's saying, each of the stories, so when thinking about kind of metadata or information that we added an abstract here to explain what stories are, to clarify why the document is still important, but that the story in the document is really the thing that we want to center. We also, those titles obviously are not the titles of those documents. So we also, as an editorial decision, remaining true to the documents, but being led both by descendant communities, but also Black studies broadly and Black history, created those titles with the idea that those sort of captured the tenor of the document, the story in it, and also were sort of true to the agency of the individual. So Marijuana sues for her freedom. It's not just a lawsuit. She is actively an agent and engaged in this work.
Whereas what we would have in the original archive is a WPA note that probably in many cases would erase or efface the agency of the enslaved person, or would just give a very straight up line by line, this document is a liberation suit of, an esclava negra nome, So this way we're able to take what we've learned from the documents and from the stories across multiple documents and give a glimpse of that humanity in a narrativized form.
We also have a page for keywords, which I feel like we had a really good time with. We talk about our definition of keywords and link it to both thinking about hashtags, but also thinking about keywords in Black studies and keywords as a device that critical ethnic studies and Black studies have engaged in order to kind of organize knowledge and to bring knowledge communities together. But we also do a deep dive into each of the 4 keywords for this micro edition, because we wanted to make clear that these are not just sort of imagined from the tops of our heads, but actually are embedded in the knowledge in the documents, as well as linked again to those other knowledge formations that are existent right now. And we wanted people to kind of enter into that knowledge production in a way that could be interesting and rich and engaging for them. So there are images with each keyword. There are links to the different stories that are part of that keyword. And there are footnotes for some of them as well, where there might be references to more information that you might find about each keyword as well.
And that is, I think, where I would like to kind of pivot to Q&A, but just here on our first page and then on each document story, we've also annotated with further sources to really have a robust citational praxis and engage deeply not only with theory but with the people who are doing the work on the kinds of stories, the kinds of people that are being discussed individually. So there should be a little bit more of that holistic element to it.
And I think too, just in the way of citations, even though we're the 4 of us here, we do work with a really big, impressive collection of transcribers and translators who helped us work through all of this, and also community partners who we talked about a lot of these stories with, who had some really, I think, incisive and insightful comments in terms of what we chose and how we presented it in the sort of final version.
Who we are indebted to immensely.
That's it from us. Question and answer.
Hi, everyone. I'm James Neal. I'm a MIF alumni, so it's really good to be back here. And thank you so much to this group of people who presented such a fascinating piece of work. I work for the Institute of Museum and Library Services, so I'm very interested in funding and labor. You gave shout-outs to RAF all throughout, and the number of people that are involved in this project. There's obviously a lot going on. So could you briefly talk about how the work was designed, what brought you to it, and then what's next? You mentioned future funding for implementation.
Yes. So again, I think I mentioned this particular keywords project was part of an original set of 3 different keywords projects. And everybody here was part of that original group, plus Dr. Emma Bilski, who has moved on and graduated. From there, we received the NHPRC planning grant, which allowed us to bring on more, now we would call them associate editors, but more folks into the core research team. But even with, it also allowed us to expand into a community team of scholars who are at Xavier, Dillard, and Tulane. And it also allowed us to open up conversations with Sheridan Libraries at JHU about being co-partners, hosting the edition, offering support as engineers, basically technical consultants similar to RAF. We were also able to bring on our own technical consultant as part of that, Alex Heel, who was also very instrumental on the digital side of things. One of the other aspects that's part of that planning grant part were summer community workshops. So we did 2 summer workshops in New Orleans each August, where we brought in 10 to 14 Black public historians, and the way we described that, which came born out of the community team, is anybody who is doing historical work as part of their practice. So that was not only professors, of course, but that was also tour guides, genealogists, founders, creators, and folks working at Black research centers, Black historical centers, and et cetera. Because one of the realities that we faced very early on was thinking about the Black historical institution and complex, which is very different in the South than it is in the Up South.
And we also did not want to be stuck in the narrow milieu of institution. So we also have culture bearers, poets. Like, this is not thinking only within kind of like an academic lens.
So in being able to sort of expand out, one of the things that we found was really instrumental, or that I found was really instrumental, was leaning on folks who were going to be leads on different teams, who could be supported through the grants in a very minimal way in a lot of ways. And working really closely with our research team, actually all of the teams, but in particular our research team, to work at the pace that the research team could move, right? So we really wanted to work at the pace that the community was moving, which community was going to move and be engaged at the pace that they were able to. But we also wanted to appreciate that the labor involved is important. That for the most part, it was mostly graduate students who are working on transcription and translation. And what are the ways that this project could be useful for them, but also could appreciate that this is meant to be a space that operates differently, right? And so by operate differently, I mean, it's not meant to be, hey, here, you're a research assistant, do this, clock in, give us 50 documents. It's meant to be a community. We're talking about very heavy questions, very heavy ideas around ethics, and ideas about what our accountability is, both to the project and also to Louisiana. So it was important that we were able to kind of build a synergy within the larger group, not just us here, but the larger group as a whole. It was important that we were able to build a citation practice. So that's to say that, like, the pace the pacing that is referenced in Moila Bailey's work and other folks who are doing slow and fast DH, not just Black DH, was actually critically important. It allowed us to grow at a sustainable way. It also means that, and I've heard this said before with transcription translations projects, like, oh, well, you're not doing enough. There's not enough documents that you are transcribed or translated, or why don't you just build an NLP and read the documents this way? But we found really early on that in actually going through the documents together as a community and thinking about the documents in French and Spanish translation together also as like a large Louisiana core, we're actually getting past some of the historiographical hangups that are blocked by language, where there's a French group of literature and a Spanish group of literature. We're actually getting past also some of the mistranslations and misunderstandings, whether it's of racialized language or of individuals' experiences in Louisiana. And we're also still able to work in a way that, folks want to be there. Like, we meet on Friday mornings at 8:30 a.m. New Orleans time, 9:30 a.m. East Coast time, and folks want to be there, right? They show up and have shown up over and over and over for the last 4 years now. So I think there's something about the pace that has been really important. The other side of it, though, not to keep talking, is that the funding piece is also a critical aspect. So he's also had to move at the pace of funding. Implementation allows us to take more seriously other kinds of partnerships. So we're talking about a partnership right now with the Amistad Research Center as potentially a space that could be home of the project. We're also able to bring on both Ellie and Shanice Calhoun, who's not here, as co-project managers, where we're able to kind of support them and their graduate student stipend in a more deliberate way. And we're also able to reach out to more associate editors, both elevating ones who have been transcriber translators, as well as bringing on folks who can be digital editorial assistants, essentially, with digital assistants for editorial markup, with the transitioning the transcription and translations over to the digital side and doing the markup. And all of that is on the keywords prime side, not the scholarly edition aspect. That, thankfully, they have a house to do those things, and all we had to do was do our work on our side. But our work was impossible without this sort of larger ecosystem and infrastructure.
Sounds promising. Thank you.
It's promising.
There's a hand in the back that's been up.
Sorry.
Up in the front.
Okay, hi, I'm Caitlin Christian Lamb. I'm a PhD candidate at the iSchool here at UNT.
Sweet.
I was wondering about, in the way that you talked about kind of stories as the emphasis over the document and sort of the sometimes impossibility of telling the full story, I was hearing a lot of echoes to Sadia Hardman's work and critical fabulation. So I was wondering if that was a big touchstone of what you guys have been working on.
I think one of the things that we have avoided is actually doing any of that, like critical fabulation and producing stories that are outside of what the documentary evidence gives us. Not because that doesn't have value, but because we are still working alongside documents, annotating those documents and pulling stories from them. But as Dr. Johnson just mentioned, there are massive historiographical hang-ups in kind of the structure of Louisiana history. You have a lot of early Louisiana, a lot of French Louisiana. You don't have much in Spanish. That's a growing kind of group of work now, but one cool thing that we've been able to do is we have folks like Dr. Johnson and myself that are able to read through the entire set of documents, both French and Spanish side, and understand that continuity over time. And that's allowed us to, I think, have more texture and more understanding of that world in which the documents live, that might give some of those elements and make those richer stories without moving away from the text too much, right?
I think that makes me think of two things. One is, I think something that was really interesting to us as we were starting to figure out how to do a digital edition. We looked at a lot of examples. We looked at some of the old print editions, and we realized that there's this question of the editor's hand, and I think a kind of long-standing school of thought that the editor shouldn't be doing too much. So in some ways we're adding a lot by tagging things like keywords. And I think the other side of that is something that's already seems like quite enriching, working with some of our community partners and especially some of our sort of academic community partners, is that it seems like people are using these documents now that we're able to make them available both in transcription and in translation to do something that could look like critical fabulation and other types of really kind of creative, inspired work. So I think that we're maybe situating ourselves more as an interlocutor, not to say that we're not interested in that, but to say that we're interested in creating a sort of vehicle through which other people can do things like that.
Yeah, and kind of weaving both of those questions together. Part of our future outside of the scholarly edition as building that larger team and that larger keywords project has moved us to a position where we have a future of a static site. We have this entire world that is being built, a digital world that's being built that then allows us to be in service to the community with our K through 12 teachers, with various community partners, which allows these documents to then be accessible to folks who otherwise would have never been able to read them and do that kind of work. Projects coming out like middle schoolers making art and stuff. It's wonderful.
That's really cool. Thank you. I was particularly interested in comparing to the more traditional editions because I used to work on a very traditional scholarly edition, the Adams Papers, a long time ago.
Ooh.
And it is very regimented. Change is very hard in those ones.
Yeah, we're definitely breaking many rules, and I think we set out when we laid sort of the foundation of the project with the bias set. The bias set is the naming of that is a riff off and engagement with Marisa Fuentes' work, thinking along the bias grain. It's also an acknowledgement that doing this, centering Black life has been so often subjected to the accusation of bias, and we're just we're just stepping into it. Even before the edition, we're just okay, so then we're just biased, right? But so be it. We just had Who Black Data, which was an amazing event a few weeks ago in Baltimore, and during the keynote, Bilfina Yawon, who is the founder of Archive Liberia, one of the things that she said in conversation with Dorothy Berry and Jennifer Morgan is that I go into the archive and I'm a propagandist. I am engaged in propaganda, period. And I thought that was so powerful and freeing to just say, we're just going to do what we have to do. And go by the guidelines and the rubric of, we're still going by guidelines and a rubric. Yeah. It's just community-centered, descendant-centered, Black Louisiana and Black history, Black studies-centered, and sort of those concentric circles.
There's always going to be the assumption that if you're a descendant, me walking into an archive as a Native woman, I can't possibly be objective. So, okay, let's lean into that. I am dotting my I's and crossing my T's and doing the historical work, yet I'm just going to say in this, we're biased. We love Black people. Deal with it. Right?
Go ahead.
On the subject of breaking the rules, one of the things that I really love about the project was the pressure that y'all are putting on TEI as a system, right? With things like dealing with the foreign question, strategically avoiding numbers in various kinds of ways. And I'm interested in whether, or sort of, if there's interest in seeing how some of those innovations on the ground can move upstream, right? To get reincorporated into TEI as a system, such that when other projects down the road are dealing with similar kinds of questions, they don't have to make up their own way, right? That TEI can become more capacious and to just sort of be plain about it, less racist.
I love speaking plainly.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I had to make a sort of candid critique of our project, in addition to all of the things that I love about it, it's in some ways that, although we really admire, Jessica Liu and Caitlin Pollock's, I think it's called Hacking TEI talk, we weren't able to use any of their elements, or we didn't end up using any of their elements. Some of the ones that I think we were really interested in were the land acknowledgements, chosen name, and cite Black women, and I think that, like, without that infrastructure in TEI, and also we probably could have made a bigger push to be in collaboration with them to use this as a sort of vehicle to make some of those things happen. I think that I do feel like there's still a lot, like that seed that they planted in terms of like TEI and Black DH is still, like, we didn't gestate it as, is that the right biology word? Germinate. We didn't do as much as we could have with that, and I think maybe now there are 2 seeds that could become a plant. I don't know. I'm going to stop this. But I think it would be great to try to push for that, and I think that question is a really good reminder for us to keep thinking about it, kind of in TEI as an institution,
and it's an enormous. I mean, it's like trying to change the dictionary, right?
And also it's predicated on like practicalities too. Absolutely. Like we didn't do all the stuff we wanted with geotagging or land acknowledgement or stuff like that because simply just time. Ref's like, okay. It's been 3 years, y'all. So
just to add to that, one of the things that we are working on through Who Owns Black Data is a white paper around the ethics of doing slavery and data projects, and so this is something that could potentially come up in that as well, because we do consider this a slavery and data project. The information that the TEI itself is data around the documents, and so there are people who are thinking in that kind of bigger picture way, and so please do look out for more of that question and more around Who Owns Black Data, because I think this is the time to be asking these questions about, okay, how do we push the bigger structures, the bigger guidelines, the bigger entities to take this seriously, and so that folks don't have to reinvent the wheel. We're now in the 3rd cohort, I think, of NHPRC planning grants of that kind, and we are in conversation with some of the projects as they continue to move forward, because I think all of them are trying to really rethink how we do editing, scholarly editing, and digital editions in exactly this way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, sorry, please.
Just a quick question. I was just wondering about your process of keyword tagging and how you all collaborated amongst each other to arrive at like a standard for making sure you're who's talking about kinship in the same way, and so that your reader was also not was drawn in a certain direction.
Yeah.
Keyword tagging.
I think what was so exciting was thinking about the expansiveness of each keyword, which I think was something we had conversations about pretty early on. So for this edition, we have wellness, fugitivity, manumission, and kinship, of course. And so you'll notice as you kind of move through the documents, thinking about sort of the different ways that those keywords are used, is both a testament to each of our different interpretations, but also of how we're coming together and thinking through the words together.
We had a conversation, a reflection this morning. We're like, do you remember why we chose this instead of this? And so we were thinking like, oh, why did we choose fugitivity instead of marriage? And then we were thinking about, oh, the value of reading across time periods and the difference between the French period and the Spanish period, marriage and coartation, and things like that. And now in our actual bias set, we have dozens of keywords.
We're up to about 100, I think. Yeah, I think we're up to about 100 keywords, yeah.
But we had to keep it tight for the edition.
Yeah. In the keyword section, it has a very detailed description of what each keyword does and some of the conversations around it. But in general, the keywords that we create are part of, so we have weekly conversations in the research team going deep dives into these questions. And the transcription and translation teams also have their own separate set of meetings. So the meaning behind each keyword is in constant conversation and constant iteration. And the keywords themselves are often generated by the workflow process. So whoever is picking the document begins the process sort of thinking through what keywords might relate. And the literal keywords are often chosen from Black Studies, Black History, Black Louisiana, historiography, or the fourth one I can think of is sort of descendant conversation, things that wouldn't necessarily be in the literature, but would be part of our conversation with community partners. So they're not sort of plucked from the sky, but they also are not always exactly sort of stable entities that come out of a dictionary of Black Studies or a dictionary of Black history. They are very much part of a conversation. So our accountability there is to be very transparent about how that conversation has moved and where those keywords are at, which is why having the keywords page was important. And so hopefully that begs a conversation from the readers, users of the micro edition, but also the larger site, where they may also can be like, oh, actually that makes sense, or oh, maybe that stretches, et cetera, et cetera. We don't expect anything, as Olivia was saying, to be the final word. It is meant to be expansive. Yeah.
Would either of you like to elaborate on controlled and uncontrollable language?
So we have, well, we won't, but because we're thinking through some ideas, sort of thinking, and this also goes to the TEI question, we're thinking through some ideas that we hope to kind of bring into publication form. So some things around TEI might be part of that, some things around controlled vocabularies and how those also relate. So we are in that process of sort of
theorizing stuff.
Yeah, thinking about some of the ideas and being able to kind of put them in publication form so that folks can not, reinvent the wheel, but also so that we can, think about what other kinds of guidelines might be available for folks to do this work.
Yeah, I think
it's a really important question that we.
Well, one thing I think that's a little unrelated to that, but going back to the original question, I think I might have interpreted it a little bit differently, like what you were asking. Like I sort of heard it as what was the sort of ins and outs of like you're looking at this document, how do you choose which sentence to put a keyword on? And I think that something that we didn't do was make like a sort of rubric or set of standards for that, but really it was just all 5 of us reading over every document, and I think kind of trusting that we could move around or add or kind of have a conversation as far as that went. And I think that that's reflective in some ways of the sort of broader project workflow in the sense that we have a lot of eyes on things and a number of layers of editorial review. We haven't talked at all about our editors yet, but we also have a group of 4 kind of senior scholars in Louisiana history who review all of our transcriptions and translations. And they didn't do that for say the keyword tagging on this site, but we did all kind of have a sort of close eye on what was there and what wasn't. And I think we were...
And every story also had a primary editor. So someone that was really sitting with that document, getting to know that marijuana, for example.
So I have 2, sorry. No, I have 2 at a time so we can go back and forth. From one of your online viewers, Samantha Stevens.
Samantha!
Right.
He remains an archive.
Glad I got a last name. So speaking of keywords, this is around the subject, they were asking, is there a story actually behind some of these design choices? So for instance, when you have fugitivity, kinship, manumission, like are there choices around color? Are there choices around, right? Is there a sense of, I guess, design thinking as well as going alongside the sort of conceptual work you guys are doing?
Oh, of course, Samantha asking the really meaty questions.
The good questions.
The meaty questions, yes. So for the scholarly edition, some of the design choices are limited by the scholarly edition, right? So there is, the micro editions are within the structure of the journal, and what you're looking at when you go to the QR code is essentially the journal. So the colors, the branding, the fonts, all of those are chosen by scholarly edition, and so we don't have so much control over that. We have control over things like formatting, like bold, italics, that kind of thing, and we have control over where and how things would be hyperlinked, what could be expanded and collapsed, and the content itself, and things like the organization of the text on the page that you will see. So like whether or not it was side by side, whether or not we had the expanding facsimile image or not, like we had some of those design principles that we could have access to. The keywords site is got a more intentional and more like sort of the keywords branding. A lot of this that you see is the colors and everything. All of that is keywords branding designed by the Black Schoolhouse in the Treme in New Orleans, a Black owned, established community organization is building a Black school, also a Black garden, also changing the world. Shani Peters and Joseph Peters, and they run a design studio and internship in which Black New Orleans youth actually do and learn design principles. And so they did our original sort of design and branding. So all of that you see is part of that, project. So yeah, so I know Remains. I know you guys are design bays. More design things to come, we promise. But also the last thing I'll say there is like the design will always be limited in some ways by minimal computing principles. And this is sort of a give and take piece, right? So minimal computing, critically important, I think, when we're talking about accessibility, and accessibility in places that are in the global south, right? Because the bandwidth is just going to be tough to have. And if it's a static site, if it's a minimally designed site, it's going to come up faster, it's going to be accessible longer, yes. However, the design, you're not going to get all the bells and whistles. You're not going to get the videos and the animations and the things that pop up and, you know, like yell at you or whatever else, like, and that can be a little frustrating for folks, particularly global south folks who are like, for whom design and aesthetics are really important. So that is a give and take. We decided to give on the minimal computing side, and I think that is the right decision. Scholarly editing, I think, has gone in that direction as well, and we knew that was the right decision when we were in Louisiana and the site was loading on people's devices in the middle of, you know, like
A storm or
on devices that are not recent devices, et cetera, et cetera. I won't call out whose device that was, Dr. Roseanne Adderley, but it was meaningful because we were like, oh wow, the site, nothing is loading, but this site, you will know about slavery in Louisiana, you'll know about Black people and their resistance. So there is that piece also that is always a give and take.
And another element there of like intentionality is really thinking about the future of archival work and the fact that history, writing, all of it, we're moving to a digital atmosphere. People are digitizing primary documents. What does this look like in spaces like Louisiana that don't have money, don't have government investment, don't have infrastructure? How can we create something that has some element of longevity? And so this speaks to many questions about the future and our partners, where this data is going to live, this archive is going to live, and how that can remain something that continues to be accessible by community, and community that quite frankly doesn't have bells and whistles at schools or universities or, you know, this, that, and the other. So.
Also, to Samantha's point, I'm looking back at the colors, and we were intentional. So, for example, I mean, we didn't do, again, Remains in Archive is very much one of our design microlabs and curatorial microlabs, and they're very into aesthetics and art. So I'm not going to do you justice, guys. I'm so sorry. But when we were thinking about the available colors, like thinking of like the swamps and fugitivity, it was the green. We had blue for wellness, kind of a cooler color.
Kinship. We had the red with the love.
We had red with the love for Kinship, and orange for manumission. I can't remember why we chose orange, but
legal document color.
Legal document color, yes. Okay, so there is where we can sort of bring that in. We were intentional. We were actually intentional about that as well. So it's a great question.
So
this, you've mentioned some words like sustainability and like longevity, but a lot of that centers on the ability for you all to do your work, and this is an especially like heavy topic at times. So I was wondering how you dealt with the affect of reading through these stories that dealt with like death and circumstances, and what you did for yourselves to ensure that you were showing up to work every day without, getting bogged down and going home and just crying for like 2 hours every day.
Well, first I'm going to say Dr. Johnson's just magical. But going back to the early days, right, when we're talking about, we're in peak pandemic. We are in peak protest. We both had toddlers or newborns. Everything was chaos and hard, and we're sitting there for literally like 2 hours a week. This would be our space to come together and talk through ethics and things that really were hard, but also so important and so uplifting in that moment. And then, as Dr. Johnson mentioned earlier, kind of having this intentionality, this praxis of care, and moving forward with that, making a space. It wasn't just like a thing. It wasn't wordy. Like, we start our meetings with, "How was your week? How's your mom and them?" Like, we try to really like care for each other in certain ways. But you're right. It is hard, and I think individuals have different ways of dealing with that, and different proximities as well, different positionalities. So that's something that we have to also be very aware of.
Olivia, Ellie, I don't know if you guys.
Yeah, I was gonna say intentionality. I was thinking of Catherine Knight Steele's radical intentionality, and
BCAT.
yeah, and just the way in which the workflow works is in I guess in my ideal week. We work on one document a week, and in the French side, that's easier than the Spanish side, because as you saw, the Spanish docs can be hundreds of pages long, whereas the French docs are limited to, I'd say, anywhere from 1 to 20 pages, but that's somewhere around there. And what's so great about the sort of community that we fostered, and just our relationships with one another as team members, is that when people can't show up some weeks, like, that's okay. And just communication with one another, and being able to say, like, take a step back, and then when some people can't show up and other people can, sort of spreading out the sort of weight of the work when we need to. It's really important to sort of what we're doing together. And
I think as a team, we've grown in ways that we've really, really like genuinely wanted to uplift each other. Shout out to Shanice Calhoun, who this morning sent us texts saying, like, can't wait to see it, love you guys, kind of a thing. Just those things are important, because those are not the things you get in your typical academic spaces, Yeah,
I think I underestimated how, or I'd forgotten, numb and traumatized, by how punitive academic spaces can be, because this is something that or had taken for granted that in Black DH this is what we do, right? Like, that there is an organizing principle and a space creation principle. I think Dr. Parham is very much part of that, and has been really formative in that for me. Dr. Foreman as well, where you show up as you need to show up, and the only thing that is like required of you is just transparency and accountability. Like, there's nothing so urgent in the academy that, like, if you've got to take a week off or however long, like, it's going to be fine, and we'll just figure out what we need to do, and we'll keep moving forward. And are you okay? Like, that's really often the first question that we're asking if somebody can't show up or if something's wrong. And that does not apparently tend to be the case, because this is something that the team has said, particularly the graduate students and undergraduate students have said over and over. And I think that is certainly a telling referendum on our profession, and how we need to be better about just creating sort of no guilt, no punitive spaces, because if you do that, although neoliberalism says the opposite, if you actually do that, people will show up, and they will show up because they want to, and they will show up and be even more invested in the work. And that is something that we have managed now, that has taken time. And so thinking from a faculty perspective and a PI perspective, like for folks who are interested in building these kind of projects, you actually do have to invest the time and the patience and the just the peace and the pace of it. It does not happen automatically. It does require folks to like also trust in you and in the accountability, and it's a back and forth, and it's not necessarily without conflict, although we think we've been brazenly without conflict for the most part.
Which was my point about magical, right?
Yeah.
Like Dr. Johnson has a way of mentoring that is very well received. So
and so so it's just it takes it's effort, and it's effort because the systems that we are in, the university as a structure does not reward that kind of pacing or time or building of community or even honesty, really. And so pace yourself.
So I have online people who are having a great time.
Hey!
Computer. Samantha says thank you. Actually, heart. And then Shanice does not want anyone to be numb and traumatized. I'm gleaning. And also from Teresa Williams, quote, thanks for sharing your interesting and important work and insight. I have a question also that I think this is something you've been saying, but maybe we can hear a little bit more from a faculty member here, Maria Valieva-Solomon, who says, thank you for this fascinating presentation and your much needed work. Could you share any advice on developing and nurturing institutional community partnerships?
Yes. So, I think. So I will say, I'll start off by saying that within the university, we've been really lucky to work closely with Sheridan Libraries, which is our current collaborate very closely with the digital team, and have agreed to be sort of stewards of the project in its current form, in its current iteration. And so thank you, Sheridan Libraries, for very much being part of this. Part of that relationship were some really rich conversations where we asked that somebody from the libraries be essentially embedded with the research team. So Margaret Burry has been part of the research team, I think, throughout this last, the second year of the planning grant, has attended every Friday meeting at 9:30 a.m. that she's been able to attend, came with us to the summer research, a summer workshop in August. And that, I think, has been really, really important to have somebody from the unit that you are collaborating with as part of the development and the research team of the project. So that they can see how it operates, so they can be part of the building of the community, and so that they can then do what they need to do to report back, to be a bridge to their unit. And Margaret's expertise has just been invaluable as a librarian, as somebody who's interested in DH at the library. We've also been, it's been amazing to work also with Emily McGinn, who's a DH librarian who was hired at Sheridan this last year, and who also spends a considerable amount of time both with the research team separately, but also with the digital team, and is embedded with them as well. So I think institutional partnerships work best when somebody from that unit is as invested in what is happening in a project as the project team members are. And sometimes that does mean embedding at the funding side. Sometimes that means a kind of co-partnership of paying for time or other kinds of compensation. But the payoff is worth it, because when people are invested in the project and the community, they're able to transmit that to the unit that they're collaborating with. The outside institutional partnerships in a lot of ways work the same way. So we, the planning grant, the original planning grant as it was written, did not have a community team. What I realized very early on is that if we were going to take seriously centering community, we actually needed to build out a core group of folks for whom that was their one job. Mm-hmm. Us doing it on the research team, as much as we were really interested in that work, it was not going to do it. And the digital team, in a similar capacity, that was not necessarily their main job. They were doing research in digital. So we collaborated with Dr. Roseanne Adderley, as well as Dr. Eva Bayham at Dillard, and Dr. Wendy Godin at Xavier University. And we became the community team, along with Shanice Calhoun, who's our community engagement fellow with Life Code. And that really that was probably the best decision and the best edit that we made on the grant throughout this entire process. More than the keywords, more than the metadata TI, having that community team was critically important. They spearheaded relationships with community partners. They're all on the ground in Louisiana, including Shanice Calhoun. They were able to bring together workshops and make decisions for our in-person engagement with community partners in a way that centered what was going on in Louisiana and New Orleans on the ground. And so, again, embedding them, we meet on a weekly basis, bi-weekly when a workshop is not immediately coming up, but mostly on a weekly basis. Embedding them with what was happening on the research team and the digital team and elsewhere was critically important. So I really think that, again, and that goes with a slower pace, sometimes building up enough trust with institutions and individual institutions so that they're willing to spend that kind of time. That's really the lead up to a grant, the beginning year of a grant, all of that. Like, it's a slow process. But when folks do feel that buy-in and feel that investment and are willing to spend that time, it changes everything on a project and becomes a true collaboration, as opposed to just sort of phoning it in or folks kind of coming on or being asked to come on later in the game. The other thing, last thing I'll say about institutional partnerships, I think it is important. Our community partners, while we built out the summer workshop later after the grant was sort of issued and awarded, we were in constant conversation with them. A lot of my work and the community team's work is being an email, phone, and meeting conversation with the community partners. And if y'all know Black folks in Louisiana, y'all know you got to have some voice conversations. You cannot be on Zoom. You need to look me in my eyes. And so we did a lot of that. And that was critically important because one thing to know about Louisiana, particularly Black Louisiana, particularly after Katrina, is that folks are always kind of trying to phone in on different individuals. Oh, will you be advisor on my grant? Oh, will you do you want our help here? Do you want our help here? And academics are very much part of that. So we made clear over the first year of the grant, leading all the way up to the workshop, that is not what we're about. We compensated folks, as much as we could, as much as the funding would allow us, for their time in the summer workshop when they came to talk to us. We let them know they didn't have to come with anything except themselves. We are not asking them to do any work for the grant, and it is completely voluntary if they want to continue with us. Everybody who came to that first workshop came to the second one, brought friends, and then some. And so it's the same thing, it is really about conversation. Some of those conversations were about, I'm just finding out about this now. Who are you? And you have to work through that because in a lot of ways, even if you are there on the ground, as community folks were, you are interlopers into people's long-standing projects. And I think that's also something that academics, I think, do not take well, is that we are not the originators of most ideas. Usually there are folks who are on the ground who are doing this work, and if we want to take that community ethos seriously, we need to meet them where they are, not think that we're coming in as experts or with anything special or any value added. And so those are the trust piece, the time piece, and in a lot of ways the compensation piece are also really important elements here.
And those are things that are really, really integral to both Black studies and Native studies, right? There's that adage that nothing about us without us. So from jump, we took very seriously the element of community partners and accountability, and not as a buzzword, not as we have to be accountable, but to actually build trusting relationships, to get to know people, to understand that folks in community, this is their lives, this is their families. We're not actually the experts. So sometimes we have to defer to them. Whereas we can have moments where we can't show up to a meeting, we got to show up for them. And those are important principles. And as someone who is from the community but has kind of operated on the research and language side of things rather than in the community stuff because I'm in Chicago, I know firsthand what the experience of post-Katrina realities were, living through that, the exploitation of people, and really the genuine despair over the possibility of loss of culture and cultural ownership. And so deferring to those people that are culture bearers, that are the people that have made that culture, whose families have been doing this for 150 years, 200 years, what have you. There is no other way, I think, that a project like this could operate and then still consider itself to be engaged ethically.
I had a question.
Hey, Kristen has a question.
So I was interested in how you all talked about Creole people and names changing over time, and I'm wondering how you were able to make sure that those names of these very individual people are kept together. Because I think about how often data collected on Black people fracture. So I'm curious about that, keeping them together. And I'm also curious about whether there were any Creole languages that were written down, and if so, how, and because I'm thinking about Creole languages as constantly in flux and changing, and not as adherent to the standardization of language. And I'm wondering what that translation process looks like.
Just because I know Leela's going to answer and I want her to, but I do want to be very clear, Keywords Black Louisiana does not have a stance on Creole as an identity or as a formulation or as a racial identity. Keywords for Black Louisiana is umbrella African descent in its most broad conception, because that is a very, very serious and deliberate conversation, essential conversations happening among descendants in Louisiana and in the diaspora, and that is a conversation that they must lead, and Keywords cannot lead that. However, Leela, as a Creole descendant, I believe has very, can answer some of the aspects of that question.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a complex question, because this is something that has an identity that has formed and reformed alongside of other forms of violences. So there are parts of community that, just like parts of family, that haven't sat around the kitchen table and talked politely to each other before. And so there's an investment back home, especially from those of us that are more on the Native side, of like doing the work and showing up for our Black kin, because that's important, and that's a place of healing of fractures that needs to happen. So in regard to kind of Creole language, you'll notice in the edition that I very meticulously went in and found any words that were actually like in a testimony that were a Creole word were labeled as Louisiana French. There's only a couple of examples, but we also have a couple of examples of Bambara. We have a couple of examples of Wolof. We have examples of those like Creole words that like they're not understood in modern day French or continental French, but they're still used in community, and people are like, oh, what does this mean? I'm like, talking about barbecue, come on, like that's just the word we use. Whereas the majority of these documents are written by the administrator, by the enslaver, so you don't get as much of that like meat in there that you want, but where it is, we've worked really hard to emphasize it.
We have that one document that, well, I guess it's not in the edition, but there was a document where we were trying to figure out the word.
Yeah, Hutchins and I talk about this a lot.
Yeah.
But I just want to add too, for thinking about names, one point which I think, I'm not even sure if we showed it, but we are capturing every name across language that someone is identified as. So I'm thinking in the edition, you'll meet Mary Aram or Marie Haram or Mariam. And sort of on the back end, which maybe Ellie can speak to more on the digital side, making sure that we have all of those names within the people reference ID, so that way we're able to sort of identify that person regardless of the language or what the enslaver is identifying them as across documents.
And one value to that, before switching to Ellie, is that descendants might not know that this is their ancestor, right? Unless you keep all of these names, you keep a record of who those enslavers may or may not have been. So having like a multifaceted approach to that person being Mariam or Marie Haram or Marie Aram, like maybe someone's like, oh wow, that might have been my great grandmother whose name was Mariam, enslaver's last name, right? And so those are ways in which we can like enforce at least a little bit or due diligence for that kinship. That way descendant communities might actually be able to identify people in the records.
And as far as the sort of back end of the site goes, still very much a work in progress. We're kind of tentatively calling this document spreadsheet the people set, but what we've decided to do after a lot of deliberation is for each document, we'll have, for each time a person's name is referenced in a document, they'll have one sort of entry on what's sort of expanded version of the spreadsheet that we showed that we used for the scholarly edition. And if someone is mentioned in, say, 2 or 3 different documents, regardless of whether their name is spelled the same way or differently or they're referenced differently, they'll have the same sort of reference ID. So it could be that, you know, one person has kind of 10 entries in this sort of people set, and hopefully using that reference ID we'll be able to sort of pull together what we know about them at any given moment in time. So if we know their age in 1740 and then there's the same name or a similar name and we know that they're 12 years older in 1752, maybe we can start using some of that like individually, like document by document determined information to try to piece things together. But we spent a really long time deciding how to do that if you have sort of one entry per person or per spelling, and I think that this should be probably the best way to go about it, but that could change because we still have a couple more months before we kind of launch our site in July, and it could be that after we have some conversations about that, when we launch our site, it changes again, which is, I think, one of the really cool and interesting things about doing DH and digital projects. But that's kind of how we have it formulated now. And if anyone has thoughts, I would be super curious to have a conversation afterwards.
I think the one thing I'll add there, and this is sort of an umbrella point, is that, again, to thinking of like pacing, workflow, funding, all of these things, all of the teams meet a lot, right? So the transcription and translation team meets every week for an hour. The research team meets every week and has met every week for 4 years now for an hour. The digital team meets every week and sometimes twice a week for an hour. Community team meets bi-weekly for a few months, but then we kick it into gear and we meet every week for an hour. Editorial and now subject matter specialists meet once a month to go over the batches that have been transcribed and translated. But they're, you know, like that's a particular, like they're reading like a whole set of material. And then I have various meetings with, don't ever be a PI project. It's just too much. I'm meeting with somebody probably every other day about keywords of Black Louisiana or one of the other Life Code projects, but usually keywords. Because it's meeting with Amistad, it's meeting with Sheridan, it's meeting with deans, it's meeting with funders, it's meeting with whoever else. So when we're saying like things are coming, we're coming to a consensus on a thing, and this is for a whole range of questions, it's really like not consensus, like we're just sort of thinking about a thing. Intensive reading practices and work are happening. Leela has created an entire syllabus for us over the last year around Black Louisiana history. Ellie has done the same thing around Black DH and thinking about DH and data. And we also have lists for community team members and work that they've produced, like in the whole range of genre work, like documentaries, art, et cetera, that we are charged with going through and getting deeper knowledge on. So we're constantly learning, constantly interrogating ideas. No stone goes unturned to the extent that we're aware of it. And then when we're aware of it, we come back to it. We come back to things that we thought we've worked through over and over and over, because we want to make sure that we are thinking as ethically and as thoroughly as possible at any point, and still keeping the window open at all times for, you know, this may not be the best practice as it turns out. Let's shift gears, because that responsiveness is also really critical, Black DH and critical ethnic studies and Caribbean DH practice.
And at the end of the year, we go to our community workshop and we present our work to our community partners, and sometimes we're told,
Yeah, so the community workshop is a week. We are there for a week as a research team. The community workshop itself, community partners are there for 1 day on a Saturday, but we are there for a week. We're meeting with archives, we're meeting with libraries, we're meeting with researchers and tour guides. Last year we did a trip to Opelousas to visit the city archives and meet with the cultural center, the cultural tourism board there. So like our work is also very much embodied and on site where we can be. And then the New Orleans folks are often gathering in various capacities. There's a couple spaces that they gather in particular these days. The Charles Dillon chapter of the Association for Study of African Life and History in Louisiana. Charles Dillon was the agitator and one of the principal leaders of the 1811 slave revolt, which is the largest slave revolt on U.S. soil. Don't at me on it. It's true. It's facts. And so that organization has come back together, and that branch started and founded. So a lot of folks will also gather there. But we are constantly in these conversations about all this stuff. And so it's good that we like each other, because otherwise
because also some of us are on more than one of these teams, so it really looks like spending like 4 to 5 hours a week together every
absolutely.
week, and then but that's good.
And everybody gets paid for it.
Yeah.
We all get some kind of wage. Now we have a new grant, wages.
No small thing.
Yeah, no, like this is not, nobody works for free. I'm sure they're not working for what they want to work, but this is not like, oh, hey, you should just do this. No, everybody gets some compensation. Transcription translation teams are in for a stipend through Life Code. All the associate editors have an hourly wage.
It's an important part of the partnership question.
Absolutely, yeah.
As well, actually. So I think we should stop there. It's hard to stop. We're 2 hours in. I think we did a great job. Thank you so much to our guests. This was so fun. And we still have cookies and falafel. Do what you will with that. You're welcome to stay.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.
That was so good.
Thank you for coming. We also have next week's talk by our very own.
We did it.
Great Q&A. That was super. That was an awesome Q&A.
Thank you so much.
I know where to find you.
I was like, wait. Yes,
Yeah, we should definitely get together and talk. Your project management experience and grant management experience could be useful to a whole lot of folks.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I'd love to.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Awesome. Awesome.
Thank you.
Distribute some more swag because everybody.
Yay! I was eyeing this one. I was like, I don't have this one. I know.
Jeff's question
I won't ask them.
Wonderful.
So to speak,
Good job,
and if it's not helpful, we can think about like an article submission.
You were doing better than you probably thought.
That's how this
I just don't know what happened. I just like panicked and then my mind was blank.
having some language.
You don't have to identify that you're struggling. You can always just pivot.
Because I know the process
And
like
it's hard being the most introverted introvert.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Yeah.